Warning. Though more gruesome details of the crimes have been omitted for our sake and yours, this episode contains details of animal abuse, necrophilia, and child murder. Please proceed with caution in mind. The vampire is an outsider. He's the perfect metaphor for those things. He's someone who looks human and sounds human, but is not human, so he's always on the margins. Anne Rice. Throughout the years, blood has been viewed in many different lights, a symbol of life, of sacrifice, and of status. No matter how it is seen, it is an essential component of human and animal life. There are, on average, 10.5 pints of blood in an adult human body. It can vary based on age and size. You can have some removed, tested, or donated to no real ill effect. But if you lose too much, you'll die. Some people see blood in a fetishistic manner. It's intimate. It's ritualistic. What happens when the fetish meets the need inside a broken and twisted mind? You get the Vampire of Sacramento. Mr. and Mrs. Chase weren't married for long before they had their first child. Richard was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, and he was followed later by his little sister, Pamela. Mrs. Chase was unstable, and she would argue with her husband constantly, though they tried to do right by their children. They took the kids on family trips, such as camping. On one such outing, Mrs. Chase accused her husband of cheating on her with a woman who was hiding in the bushes and ruined the trip. Another of Mrs. Chase's complaints was that her husband drugged her so he could annoy her in her sleep. Whether Mrs. Chase's complaints were real or delusional, Mr. Chase certainly wasn't perfect. He would use physical discipline to punish his son, however, it was nothing out of the ordinary for families at the time. By the age of 5, Richard displayed evidence of all 3 parts of the McDonald triad. The triad is a set of factors: animal cruelty, obsession with setting fires, and persistent bedwetting past age 5, considered to be indicative of violent psychopathy. If a person has these traits, it is believed they would be more likely to display violent, homicidal, and sexually predatory behaviors. Though worrying, the issues didn't seem to affect much of Richard's childhood. He was popular as a little boy and even had 60 kids attend one of his birthday parties. Richard's adolescence and teen years were less happy. He became a heavy drug user, partaking in marijuana and LSD. He also learned he suffered from impotence, which prevented him from having relationships with women. When he was in his early teens, Richard believed he was a member of the James Younger gang alongside Jesse James and his brother Frank. He would paste his head onto photos of the 19th century gang and tried to sell his altered photos to others. During this time, he wanted a cowboy hat to help him look more the part of the gang member, but his mother refused to buy one. Another of the strange behaviors Richard exhibited in his teens was to sleep naked in the family lounge with the heat cranked as high as it would go and the windows open. Despite his drug problem and eccentricities, Richard was still considered popular and clean-cut through high school. As he entered adulthood, he grew withdrawn and unkempt. Even still, he attended American River College after high school. Unfortunately, his grades would start to slide and he would skip classes until he finally dropped out altogether in 1971. After dropping out, Richard worked odd jobs around Sacramento, but none of them lasted long due to his heavy drug usage. He also had terrible hypochondria. One of his chief complaints was that his heart had stopped beating, or that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery. He believed his cranial bones separated and moved around, and shaved his head to watch it happen. Richard would also put oranges on his head, believing that his brain would absorb the vitamin C via diffusion. Richard, despite his odd behavior, found an apartment and roommates in 1971. Sid Evans DeMarchi and Rachel Statham would come home one day in February to find Richard sitting on their lawn. Somehow, he convinced them to let him move in. Richard was often high and would walk around the apartment naked while guests were over. He also barricaded himself in his room so that no one would sneak up on him. Unable to handle Richard's strange behavior, Sid and Rachel moved out not long after he moved in. Rachel's brother and his friends would take their places as roommates, but this arrangement wasn't much better. The new tenants had a band, and Richard would often interrupt their practice, wanting to play the conga with them. They didn't want him to join since he didn't sound good, but he did anyway. Understandably, this caused numerous arguments and they all moved out. Unable to afford rent on his own, Richard moved home. His parents divorced in 1972, so Richard split his time between them. He and his mother argued frequently, and he believed she was trying to poison him. This was something she had accused her husband of doing to her when Richard was a child. Richard's strange accusations extended beyond his family as well. During a trip to Utah in 1972, Richard was arrested for driving under the influence. He told his parents he was being gassed in the local jail and wanted to sue the police. His father ended up bailing him out and convinced him not to sue. Richard was difficult to live with, and neither of his parents could handle him for too long. When Richard's father kicked him out, he would simply stand and stare at the property for extended periods of time. Despite obvious signs of mental health issues, Richard's father believed his son's problems were due to laziness and misguided values. In late 1972, during one of Richard's arguments with his mother, she threatened to call the police on him. He took the phone from her and hit her over the head with it. She got the phone back and called the cops while Richard fled. When police caught him, they offered to press charges, but his mother declined. After this, Richard went to stay with his grandmother in Los Angeles for the first of 2 visits. On the first visit, she noticed his odd behavior. It was difficult to miss when he would stand on his head in the corner of his room, mutter to himself, and roam the house at night. During this stay, Richard worked for his uncle driving a bus for mentally disabled children. He never cleaned the bus and let it run low on oil despite only needing to take it into the designated shop. His inability to follow instructions and lack of cleanliness led to him losing his job. After being fired, Richard spent a lot of time sleeping or wandering the house. He was convinced that someone was trying to break into his grandmother's house through one of the windows. He also complained that his heart hurt and there was pain in his legs. During Richard's second stay, he got a job at a paint store. This job only lasted a few days before he was fired. Richard's grandmother said his mental health and physical state deteriorated during this stay. Unfortunately, things would only worsen when he permanently returned to Sacramento in the summer of 1973. In a strange attempt to figure out what was wrong with him, Richard began cutting pictures of human organs out of medical magazines and putting them all over his bedroom. At one point, he called an ambulance, but they refused to take him to the hospital because he was not suffering a medical emergency. He begged his mother to help, but both doctors she sent him to said there was nothing wrong with him. After these failed visits, he went to see Dr. Donald Ansell, who concluded that Richard had a psychiatric disturbance of major proportion. Still, Richard was not receiving the care he thought he needed. After seeing a story on TV about a cat that received high-quality medical treatment, he killed one of his own cats because he believed he deserved the treatment. In December, Richard was admitted to a psychiatric ward for 2 days after coming into American River Hospital with a list of imaginary problems. He said he couldn't breathe, that his blood stopped flowing through his body, that he was suffering cardiac arrest, and that he lost his pulmonary vein. Though staff said he may have been suffering a drug-induced psychosis, he was officially diagnosed with acute paranoid schizophrenia. Richard was discharged against medical advice when his mother confronted staff. She was highly aggressive, hostile, and provocative. For 2 years after the incident, Richard was on medication, and his mental health improved. He had an oxygen tank to help with his panic attacks, and he even put on 20 pounds. According to his mother, all of his improvement was undone when he started doing drugs again. His father disagreed. Richard's mother also said she heard her son talking to himself again, that he had trouble signing his name, and he believed she and his sister Pamela were trying to control his mind. During some of the numerous arguments that Richard had with his mother, she would put his father on the phone. This would send Richard into fits of rage. He slapped his mother and destroyed things. Richard quickly became too much for either of his parents to handle, and they decided to get him his own apartment. This was possibly the worst thing they could have done. Richard's apartment was close to a rabbit farm. He would take his bike to the farm and buy rabbits so that he could eat them raw. During one of his father's regular visits to play chess, he asked Richard about the rabbits, and Richard said he ate them. Used to his son's odd comments, his father thought nothing of it. In 1976, Richard was involuntarily committed for the second time. He was taken to emergency after injecting rabbit blood into his veins. His father found him in his apartment, vomiting and barely able to move due to blood poisoning. He told hospital staff that he ate a rabbit with battery acid in its stomach. Staff concluded that Richard was mentally ill. During his stay at the psychiatric ward, Richard complained of heart weakness and his body falling apart. He refused to participate in any group activities, and they eventually transferred him to Beverly Manor Psychiatric Hospital. While at Beverly Manor, the staff nicknamed Richard Dracula because he enjoyed drinking blood. He broke the necks of 2 birds he caught and drank their blood. He also stole syringes and took blood from the therapy dogs. In late 1976, Richard was released into the care of his mother. Following treatment with psychotropic drugs, doctors concluded that he was no longer a danger to society. Staff disagreed with doctors, saying Richard needed extensive care and didn't receive it. Nevertheless, he was released. Without consulting doctors, Richard's mother weaned him off his medication because she didn't like how it made him like a zombie. She also got him another apartment. No longer medicated and stable, and once again in his own space, Richard upgraded from rabbits to dogs. He would purchase puppies, take them home, kill them, eat their innards, and drink their blood. His mental and physical state were so bad that he even stopped letting his mother into his apartment and would only speak to her through a crack in the door. Though it wasn't uncovered until later, Richard was arrested in 1977. He was found on a Native American reservation in Pyramid Lake, Nevada, naked and covered in blood. A bucket containing a liver was found in his truck, and witnesses said Richard was seen with a dog, though the animal was never found. At the scene, Richard claimed the blood was seeping out of him, and he didn't know what happened to the dog. The blood was later determined to be cow's blood, and no charges were filed. In December 1977, Richard bought a .22 caliber pistol, lying about his mental illness to do so. After this, neighbors said they heard shooting noises from his apartment. Richard claimed he was shooting at the voices in his head, which was corroborated by bullet holes in the walls. He also later said it was now easier to kill the dogs he brought home. On December 29th, Richard claimed his first human victim in a drive-by shooting. 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin was unloading groceries in his driveway. His death was originally considered to be a heart attack, but when it was discovered that he was shot, police were baffled. It was a completely random attack. Richard would later say the murder was the result of an argument with his mother. She had told him he was not welcome home for Christmas because Pamela was scared of him. He had recently killed a cat in front of his mother and sister and then smeared its blood all over his body. 2 weeks after killing Ambrose, Richard tried to break into a woman's house but was easily deterred by locked doors. He believed locked doors meant he was not welcome, while unlocked doors were an invitation. Shortly after, he broke into a house belonging to a young family. He defecated and urinated on the infant's bed and clothing and was then chased off by the couple while he burgled the house. Next, he broke into another home where he tried to set the drapes on fire. He claimed the residents were spying on him and he wanted them to leave the neighborhood. On January 23, 1978, Richard's break-ins turned deadly. Teresa Wallen, who was 3 months pregnant, was in the process of taking the garbage out when she ran into Richard. She threw her arms up to defend herself, and he shot her in the hand. He then shot her in the cheek, breaking her jaw. A third shot to the head rendered her unconscious, but didn't kill her, unbeknownst to Richard. Despite his impotence, Richard raped what he believed was Teresa's corpse. As he did, he stabbed her repeatedly with a butcher knife he took from her kitchen. Richard removed multiple organs, and her spleen was cut completely from her body. Her kidneys were severed and moved, placed beneath her liver. Richard cut off one of Teresa's nipples and drank her blood through a yogurt cup he took from the trash bag she had been taking out. He then stuffed dog feces down her throat. Richard wore gloves for the murder, but did nothing to hide his actions or clean up the scene. He even left the knife behind. It would later come to light that Teresa was alive during part of her mutilation. Teresa's husband, who was a trucker, had been working at the time of the murder. He was the first to discover her body. Meanwhile, Richard went home and spent the rest of the day watching television. Just a few days later, on January 27th, Richard killed again. He entered the home of 38-year-old divorced mother Evelyn Meroth and killed everyone inside. David Meredith, a friend of Evelyn's, was shot twice in the head. Evelyn's 6-year-old son, Jason, was also shot in the head. Evelyn's 22-month-old nephew, David, was fatally shot. After shooting Evelyn, he mutilated her with a kitchen knife before committing acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. Semen was found inside Evelyn's mutilated body, suggesting Richard was able to overcome his impotence and have sex with her corpse. Richard also mutilated the corpse of David and drank his blood. Evelyn's body was found in bed, but the bathtub was full of blood. It is unclear if she was bathing when Richard killed her or if he bathed afterward. The series of events is unclear, as Richard was unable to remember some of his actions. During the mutilations, Richard was startled by a knock at the door. He panicked, took the body of the 22-month-old David, and ran. He left 2 of the knives he used in the house and the third in the yard. Stealing Dan Meredith's car, he went back to his apartment. Here, he decapitated David's body and ate parts of the brain because he was hungry. The family of the girl who knocked on the door called the police, who launched the investigation. The investigators said the Meroth residence was a house of carnage. When they discovered the baby was missing, they had little hope of finding him alive. Along with the knives, Richard also left full hand and shoe prints in Evelyn's blood. Due to the nature of the scene, it was immediately connected to the murder of Teresa Wallen. Special Agent Russ Vorpagel of the FBI brought in profiler Robert Ressler to assist with the case. They said the murderer was a white man in his 20s who was suffering from mental health issues that began in his mid-teens and worsened considerably. The killer likely also didn't take care of himself and had a dirty, disheveled appearance. During both murders, Richard wore an orange parka that his father recently purchased for him. Neighbors reported that on the day before the Meroth murders, a man in an orange parka with long, disheveled hair was going door to door asking for old newspapers. Police used the FBI profile and neighbor statements to create a sketch. Richard's arrest came after an old high school acquaintance came forward with a statement. She had run into him while shopping, but hadn't immediately recognized him because he had changed so much. She noticed the bloodstains all over him and a yellow crust around his mouth. It wasn't until he introduced himself as Rick that she recognized him. She was so unsettled that, when he asked for a ride, she locked her car door and drove off. This was shortly after he killed Teresa. When police first came to arrest Richard, he refused to let them inside. The officers spoke to one another loudly outside his door and pretended to leave. The tactic worked, and Richard exited the apartment. When he saw the police, he tried to flee and resisted arrest, but they tackled him. In 2010, Detective Wayne Irie admitted he contemplated shooting Richard. He said, "That's when I found out I'm not like him. Even though it would have been a good shooting, it would have been a justified shooting, I couldn't kill him. And I would have been justified in doing it. Because the average person, cops included, are not like these people. He's a cold-blooded killer." Upon his capture, Richard was uncooperative. He claimed he only killed some dogs and was being framed by Italians. He also said the murders were done by a blonde man in an orange jacket and that someone was coming in and out of his apartment. When police searched Richard's apartment, it was like something out of a nightmare. The walls, floor, ceiling, and every drinking and eating utensil were soaked with blood. There were several dog collars found. Rotting organs belonging to both his animal and human victims were discovered. Richard had been reading gun and psychology magazines, and he had circled ads in the paper for dogs that were for sale. Police also found a calendar that had "today" written on a total of 46 days, including the days of Teresa's and Evelyn's murders. 22-month-old David's body was not found in the apartment. They wouldn't locate the decapitated body until March of 1978. It was found in a box at the bottom of a garbage bin. After his arrest in January, Richard was interviewed by psychiatrists. They asked him what was on his mind, but he had no answer. When they rephrased the question to be what was on the screen in his mind, like he was watching television, he was more forthcoming, though not much. He told them he saw normal things, and an exploding 747 jetliner. He also claimed he was Jewish and was beaten up by gangs of Italians due to his ethnicity. In 1979, Richard Chase would stand trial for 6 counts of murder. He wanted a lawyer from the Jewish Defense League, but was denied. He also tried to claim the food they gave him in custody was poisoned and demanded his defense lawyer have it tested. He did, and predictably, the results came back negative. In order to avoid the death penalty, Richard's defense tried to have him found guilty of second-degree murder. Their case hinged on Richard's mental illness and lack of premeditation therein. His guilt was not in question, as during the trial he quickly admitted to the crimes by saying, "I didn't kill anybody, just a few people." While he didn't have much to say about Teresa's murder, when asked about the Miroth family, Richard replied, "I was sick, poisoned by iodine or mercury. I was trying to get free of poison place and go live with my grandmother's relatives. The car had broken down and I had no money, so I walked into somebody's house and killed them." Richard would go on to say that he needed blood and went to several places but couldn't get any. His lack of blood was preventing him from living a normal life. Richard claimed the blood from animals was not helping and explained, "I couldn't cope with the world anymore because every time I tried to get up and act like a human being, I couldn't because of the weakness. I went on welfare and got in Beverly Manor, so now I've got a trial pending, I guess." Richard pled not guilty by reason of temporary insanity and requested to be seen by a heart specialist for his stolen pulmonary artery. He told the jury he was a good person but had a weak heart and mind. He was also afraid his victims would come back from the dead. During the trial, Richard's mother confronted Teresa's husband, criticizing their German Shepherd for not protecting them the day the murder happened. He told her that she should have protected them from her son. On May 8, 1979, Richard was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death via the gas chamber. The prosecution convinced the jury that, While Richard was mentally disturbed, he knew what he was doing. He wore gloves, which indicated a certain level of premeditation. Richard was sent to San Quentin prison. His fellow inmates were afraid of him and often tried to persuade him to kill himself. He behaved psychotically from the moment he entered the prison and was sent to a facility for the criminally insane in Vacaville, California. In April 1980, he was deemed stabilized and sent back to San Quentin. His thoughts were still strange and scattered, however. Richard wanted to be transferred to an East Coast prison to be closer to the government and to be safe from UFOs. He wrote several documents blaming the murders on UFOs, the CIA, the mafia, and airline disasters. He said that a UFO tracked him for 6 months prior to the murders, that he was born of a UFO cloning experiment, and that the cloning experiment caused him to be born with a Star of David on his forehead. He also claimed that his mother had been trying to poison him since he was a year old. In order to validate the profile he created, Robert Ressler visited Richard to interview him in 1979. Richard spent the interview talking about his fear of Nazis, UFOs, and being poisoned. He told Ressler he was considering appealing his sentence because he was a victim of soap dish poisoning. According to Richard, everyone has a soap dish, and if they lift the soap and the part underneath is dry, they are fine. But if it's gooey, they have soap dish poisoning. When Ressler asked what the soap dish poisoning had done to Richard, he said it turned his blood to powder, and he killed to replenish his blood. He claimed the soap dish poisoning was being perpetuated by Nazi UFOs. Richard asked for access to a radar gun so he could apprehend the Nazi UFOs and have the Nazis stand trial for the murders. Richard again insisted he was Jewish. At one point during the interview, Richard handed Ressler a large amount of macaroni and cheese he had hoarded in his pants pockets. He believed the prison officials were in league with the Nazis and were trying to kill him with poisoned food. Richard was found dead in his cell at 11:05 a.m. on December 26, 1980. The autopsy revealed he died from an overdose of Sinequan, a drug used to treat depression and hallucinations. He took 36 times the normal dose after hoarding the medication without the knowledge of prison officials. When he was found, he was on his stomach with his head buried in the mattress and his legs extending off the bunk. The guard who checked on him earlier said that he was lying on his back, breathing normally. Next to his bed were 4 sheets of paper covered in handwriting. 2 of the sheets contained squares filled with an unknown code. The other 2 had passages that indicated he would take pills to stop his heart. In a 1992 interview with Robert Ressler, the profiler said, "The rule is to stay out of commenting on the fantasy and, by your comments, urge him to continue." He believed Richard should have been permanently institutionalized. Ressler also said that he thought the overdose that caused his death was likely an accident rather than a suicide, and he only took the large dose to quiet the voices in his head. Throughout his life, Richard's problems were pushed aside or written off. They were downplayed by both of his parents and fully enabled by his mother. He needed rehabilitation and medication, but those were always taken away. All too often we encounter villains who could have been helped if their medical needs had been met, and all too often, cries of help are ignored. Unfortunately, we will never know if the lives of Richard's victims may have been spared had his mother not taken him off his much-needed medication.